Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mihao Zhai, an assistant professor of Global China Studies here at NYU Shanghai. It's a great honor to be here and to introduce today's speaker, Professor James Robson. Professor Robson is the James Kralik and Yunli Low Professor of Eastern Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard and also the director of the renowned Harvard Yanqing Institute. As many of you know, Professor Robson is a leading scholar in the study of the history of medieval Chinese Buddhism and Taoism. His research interests cover the issues of sacred geography, local religious history, talismans, and Chan Buddhism, etc. His 2009 book, Power of Place, The Religious Landscape of the Southern Sacred Peak Nanyue in Medieval China, gives a panoramic depiction of the sacred mountain's significance in China's different religious traditions. The book won the prestigious Julian Prize and the Toshihide Numata Book Prize in Buddhism in 2010. As the book shows, Professor Robson's work cares about the two major traditions in Chinese religion, namely Buddhism and Taoism, and the interactions between the two. As proof of this broader interest, I also know Professor Robson is working on a project on what is perhaps the most famous Taoist text of all, the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, his research does not stop at the medieval period. Over the past decade, he has been involved in a long-term collaborative research project studying local religious statuary primarily made in the 19th and even the 20th century in Hunan province. I actually had the pleasure of hearing him talk about it this past June. He also does not confine his research to China alone, but extends his scope to the Eastern Asian world. He used to be part of a research project on the Korean Busan tradition, a practice of placing all kinds of sacred objects inside the Buddhist statues. And currently, he's also working on a long-term project on the history of the confluence of Buddhist monasteries and mental hospitals in Japan. Personally, I also benefited tremendously from Professor Robson's work. I knew him when I was a master's student at Fudan, and my own dissertation on the Buddhist talismans in China was also deeply inspired by his 2008 paper on the talismanic writing in Chinese Buddhism. So it's both an honor and a full circle moment to be introducing him today. And now we will witness Professor Robson expanding his research territory again. His talk today is titled From Monks to Merchants, Assessing Buddhism in the Philippines, the Land of Gold. Since I know absolutely nothing about Buddhism in the Philippines, I very much look forward to his talk today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor James Robson.
Thanks, Ninja. Thank you so much. Very nice. All right. So after a day when you've all had to, you've sat through 17 different talks already, I'm sure that many of you are ready to go to dinner right now. And I'm the last thing between you and that. And so I'll try to keep this succinct for you, and hopefully I'll explain a little bit of why I've chosen this as a topic. In fact, I realized I didn't update the title here, and what was given is actually a better title because in fact, it's more about Buddhism generally in the Philippines and not just Chinese. In fact, very little about Chinese Buddhism per se, as you'll see as we go along. And Minjiao mentioned my book, that Power of Place, which has been sitting in the Censor Bureau here in China for the last 10 years, the Chinese translation of it. But I just heard that the translation is now finally going to be released. But last night, the editor wrote to me and said that even though the subtitle is The Religious Landscape of the Southern Sacred Peak, they had to take out the word Zongjiao from the title, and now they want it to have it as Wenhua Guanjian. So these issues are being felt viscerally by some of us of what's going on. So, let me just begin. Oh, I should also say that for those who are attending this workshop, and we heard your presentations this morning, and many of you received feedback from us about your projects, giving you all kinds of ideas. This talk tonight is also very much experimental for me, so you can take your revenge on me if you like, and you can then tell me what the problem is. So I look forward to hearing your comments. So let me talk about where this talk began. And I'm sure many who are here that know my research have realized it's primarily focused on East Asia, China, and a little bit on Japan. But this takes me back to my own birth, actually. In 1965, you can see the date. My 60th birthday is coming up very soon, first day of December 1965. So I was actually born in the Philippines for a somewhat strange and even ironic history. And this goes back, my father was Canadian and my mother's family were all immigrants from Austria. And my dad, as a Canadian, signed on to the US Navy for whatever dumb reason, as you'll hear, but never became a US citizen. He remained a Canadian citizen. In fact, I recently have applied for my Canadian citizenship just as a kind of well, I would call it a trump card, but that might be stretching things a little bit. And so I'm waiting to hear that if I have it, just as a safety net. But in any case, during the Vietnam War, many of you will know that about 40,000 Americans went to Canada to get out of the US draft. And my father was one who came from Canada to the US and then was stationed in a place called Subic Bay. This is 1965, the streets outside of the US military base there. And so I was born during a time when my mother had moved over there. And then February 6th, so this was the January of 1968, and this is my dad here. And he had sent out a letter just about what was going on and actually mentions the fact that I had been born and what was going on. But then the Tet Offensive hit in February 6th. He was killed in Saigon at that time. And so my mom moved back to the US, and I grew up sort of in this cloud in the US. Many of you will know that the Vietnam War had a real stain kind of on American history at that time. And so when I was growing up, to sort of say, oh, I was born in the Philippines, people were like, where's the Philippines? Why is that? And so I always kind of downplayed it, that this was a place where I was born, and never really talked about it at all, and kind of pushed it aside. And though I had mentioned in my opening comments that I was director of the Asia Center for a while, and as part of that, as I mentioned, was to try to have Harvard build up its representation and study of Southeast Asia. And as part of that, I realized this was a moment in my life where I could try to go back to sort of roots and say, hey, let's turn something that was kind of a bad or something that was kind of an embarrassing moment in one's identity and do something academically with it and try to turn it around and go back. And rather than resist it, to try to bring it into my own, not just life in general, but as an academic pursuit as well. And so, I spent some time as the director of the Asia Center building up connections, particularly with Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and eventually got finally languages. I think languages are the foundation for everything, as you know, for us to begin any kind of academic scholarship. So now Indonesian, Thai, and Tagalog are now taught at Harvard. And Tagalog was the one, getting it taught at Harvard is the first time in it's almost 400-year history, which is to say something quite historic, I think. And in addition to that, a wealthy donor in the Philippines then convinced them to give a substantial amount of money to endow that position. So Tagalog will never go away. It will be there forever at Harvard. And so tonight's talk is really kind of linked to that, but it also, by going to the Philippines, starting to go. I went once in 1986, I think was the first time that I went back. It was basically to find the nanny who raised me, who I was able to track down. And then I also had some friends in the Peace Corps there, and I arrived on this small island there, Tikau Island, and it had just happened to be the night of, fashion shows in the Philippines are a big deal. This island, it was the island's big fashion show, and so I had just arrived, and so they made me an honorary judge for the fashion show, which was quite amusing. But in any case, so I started going after that, and this kind of grew out of that, and it came together with a slightly different interest, which is to think about what's been ignored in Southeast Asian studies as well. And I think the Philippines fits into that category. So that's kind of the background for tonight. And I think one of the reasons why Buddhism, and even the Philippines more generally, but particularly Buddhism in the Philippines, has been ignored is that based on surveys of the leading up, I think the most recent one was around 2022 or 3, so it might be off a little bit. But there's only about around 40,000 Buddhists in the Philippines of a population of around 100 million, excuse me. And so it's only about 0.03% of the population that is classified as Buddhist in the present day. And so if you, I think for most people, the most common image of the Philippines is as a Catholic country, which it very much is to this day. And so we have lots of books about Catholicism in the Philippines, and even very good books. In fact, Vicente Rafal and Deirdre de la Cruz. But the one book that's been written thus far on Buddhism in the Philippines by Ari Dai is really putting it in the context of this Catholic context of Philippine history. And so that has, I think, skewed the historical record, and also sort of ignored the longer history of Buddhist connections to the Philippines. And the real issue here is the arrival of the Spaniards and the Spanish colonization of the Philippines from the 16th century onward. So I took it as a kind of a challenge when I decided to try to do something with this academically, was to say, could we write a history of pre-Spanish colonial contact Philippines and the role of Buddhism within that? So that was the overall goal, to try to block off Spanish colonialism and look at the pre-contact period. And that was much harder than it sounded, actually, for reasons which I'll get into. So, so I think in general, the study of Asia has generally been focused on the histories and cultures of East Asia. South Asia has also traditionally attracted some attention. As Southeast Asia rises up in importance, it has slowly begun to take its place within academia. So I think Southeast Asian studies, people's eyes have been opened up of the importance of this region and the consequences of ignoring it in our scholarship. And so sinologists, that is to say scholars of China, themselves have also come around to recognizing the significance of South and Southeast Asia as they've studied the interconnected relationships that have existed across Asia in the past and even more so in the present. But I think we shouldn't be, we shouldn't sort of think about, the kinds of modern connections that we see, interconnectivity that goes from East Asia to South Asia to Southeast Asia, as something new. But in fact, this has a very, very long history, as I think most of you will know here. But to date, much of the previous attention has been directed at connections between China and India, and to some extent down into Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Now, the temporal focus of studies dedicated to the interconnections between China and India have largely looked to the past, but that's also slowly changing as many of even the projects that we've heard today. But Tansen obviously has written on this going quite a ways back into history, at least to the 7th century or so. Now, there have been many systematic works that have described the history of connections between East Asia, China in particular, and India and Southeast Asia. But the Philippines has largely been ignored in those works. When attention has been directed at the Philippines, it has rather been presentist in its orientation, that is to say, focused just on the present. Heretofore, the focus has primarily been, as I've mentioned, on Spanish or even American colonial eras that span from about the 16th century to the 20th century, and on the period when the Philippines gained independence from the US in 1946 as well. There is, of course, a long and distinguished history of scholarship on Buddhism in Southeast Asia, including some very recent work by Andrea Acri, for example, that's been very good and contributed a lot. But much of that work has also excluded the Philippines, which was which was considered to be on the outer margins of the maritime regions that primarily covered peninsular Southeast Asia and Indonesia, looking mainly to South Asia for its influence. More recently, scholars like Wang Gongwu and Kenneth Dean, among others, have explored the maritime trade networks, which served as conduits for the transmission of culture and religion from South China, primarily from the Fujian region. But again, except for Wang Gongwu's seminal essay, Merchants Without Empire, the Hokkien Sojourning Communities, which addresses the Chinese trading communities that became established in Manila, and then also Jeff Wade's article, An Early Age of Commerce in Southeast Asia. The Philippines has largely been absent in those works. So if we look at just some maps, just to show you a little bit, just to remind you of the geography, you can see here the Philippines highlighted here, but then looking at the tremendous array of islands which stretch down. But if you look just how close Palawan comes down to the northern tip of Borneo, it basically is an extension all the way into Borneo. And then the southern part of Mindanao gets very close to the northern parts of Indonesia. And we see this even on some other more simple maps here, but you can see the connections that extend here. But for the most part, the studies that people have done on the merchant connections between particularly the area of Fujian here have almost exclusively gone along the coastal part of mainland Southeast Asia and down, and then obviously connecting to Singapore, where there's been a lot of recent work on migration from the Chinese communities up here down into that region as well. And so even some maps that get published in books that are on the Southeast Asian ports and other sites in the 6th century completely cut the Philippines. There's the southernmost tip of Palawan, but it's cut off of the maps. And so this was, to me, a problem. Like, why is the Philippines always being kind of kept out of the bigger picture of the connectivity that extends down into Southeast Asia? And so what I'm hoping to do tonight is to resituate the Philippines and suggest other forms of connectivity and other routes that were established down further into Southeast Asia, both with the Philippines as a center of some of that activity, but also as a transition point for ships that were going all the way down, in many cases, cutting over to Taiwan, then down to the Philippines, and then navigating the inward seas here, and then going all the way down into Indonesia as well. So, to go back to Wang Gongwu, he's, I think, described very well the uptick in the presence of Chinese in the Philippines from the late, for him, primarily around the period of the late 16th century. He's written, for instance, that, quote, the number of Hokkien merchants reached its peak at the end of 1603, and it was estimated by the Spanish authorities that there were between 24,000 and 30,000 Chinese in the Philippines on the eve of the massacre that happens in the Philippines, which is an extraordinary number considering that the total population of Spaniards and Mexicans residing in the Philippines was only 1,200 at that time, of whom about 700 lived in Manila. And it was in 1567 when the newly ascended Ming Emperor Longqing approved the repeated plea of the Fujian governor and the Grand Censor Du Zemin that Hokkien junks began sailing from Yuegang, that is Moon Harbor, a well-known port for the smuggling trade in Zhangzhou, and allowed them to then trade overseas legally. So for 4 years, the Spaniards worked their way into the Philippine Islands and established themselves in Manila. And in other words, it was only after the 1570s that junk trade between Fujian and the Philippines, with an exchange of exceptionally high-value cargoes, entered into a completely new era, which in turn brought China into the world economical system. Now, while goods and trade were at the forefront of this history, I think we can safely presume that they also imported Chinese culture and religion in their travels to the Philippines. Now, emblematic of such trends, that is to say, in focusing on the later history, in the study of the religious history of the Philippines, especially the focus on post-colonial and even modern Philippine Buddhism, is the book I showed you earlier by Ari Dai, which really just focuses on the modern period. I'll come back to that at the very end of the talk, actually. And what I want to suggest here, however, is there is much more to be told about that story, and I'll get to some of the more recent material a little bit later. So what I'd like to do in the talk this evening is to address two primary absences in sinological studies on Southeast Asia. One, I want to integrate the history of the pre-colonial Philippines into the larger history of the movement of monks from China to South and Southeast Asia, while at the same time situating the Philippines in maritime trade networks that connected China, again, primarily Fujian, and Southeast Asia via nodes that developed in the Philippines. As the talk will show, I hope, the earliest phase of history is marked by contacts with Buddhist monks, and then only later, Chinese culture and religion began to be transmitted via these merchant sojourners or travelers through the region. Now, the second part of the talk will try to assess the status of what we know of the history of Buddhism in the Philippines based on some recent archaeological finds that also seem to connect it with larger sinological issues, but also South Asian studies. It's important to acknowledge from the outset, however, that there is a lack of written sources concerning that history, so we will necessarily have to turn to the material record. So this is really an issue of the impact of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines was so dramatic and so traumatic that it almost destroyed the entire written archive, and it also led to, because they were Catholics who were missionizing, they had a strong iconoclastic perspective and destroyed almost all images that pre-existed their arrival in the Philippines. And so that presents us with a really big scholarly or interpretive problem of how do you work in the absence of a rich textual base and even a compromised material base. And so those are some of the challenges for doing a project like this that I had to face. So let's see what we can say. So it's generally believed that hundreds of years before the coming of the Spaniards, a flourishing trade had developed between the Philippines and South China, during which large quantities of trade pottery and other goods from China were brought to the islands. Much of the previous work has been focused on the large hoards of Chinese tradeware ceramics that have been excavated in various parts of the Philippines, but especially in the Calatagan region. And most of these date from the Ming Dynasty, from about the 15th century and after. So we have, this was to show you the other routes that local Philippine scholars have begun to include that incorporate the Philippines into those networks. Again, this just shows the uptick in Chinese boats arriving from Fujian into Manila during that period. Now, these are some of the excavations that took place. Unfortunately, there's not a very organized archaeological program in the Philippines that's doing a large-scale archaeology. It's very episodic, and I've been trying to encourage them to do more for reasons which I'll talk about in a minute. But these are the types of areas where a lot of the ceramics were found, were in burials, where dishes were put upside down next to the corpse inside of tombs. And when we look at those ceramic objects, one can see that these are of Chinese production and have come to the Philippines. So you can see the Chinese characters on these here, and a lot of the symbolism that you find on the decorative motifs are Chinese in origin. And even here you have the reverse swastika, Buddhist symbol that is on the bowl as well. And then this plate is in the Harvard Art Museum, which is a Yuan Dynasty plate that shows I guess we'd call it a jilin, or one of these sort of mythical creatures that's clearly of Chinese origin as well. And so these are some of the early objects that were excavated archaeologically. Now, so some attention has been focused on India-China trade, especially under the Chola Kingdom, with less emphasis on the active network of the Srivijayan Kingdom and its domination of trade in Southeast Asia. But as is well known, I Ching, the famous Chinese monk and scholar, had stayed in Sumatra from 687 to 689 on his way to India. And when he wrote about Srivijaya's splendor, he wrote, quote, "Buddhism was flourishing throughout the islands of Southeast Asia. Many of the kings and the chieftains in the islands in the southern seas admire and believe in Buddhism, and their hearts are set on accumulating good action." As is well known, the Srivijaya Empire flourished as a Buddhist cultural center for roughly 600 years or so, and primarily in the southern part of Sumatra, but extending all the way up the Malay Peninsula. Now, with the arrival of Catholic missionaries, there was, as I said, a wholesale, destruction of local religious practices and the destruction of the material record of that period. That legacy has resulted in the general opinion that the Philippines was an animist country prior to the arrival of Catholicism and Islam. I showed you the book of Vicente Rafael just a minute ago called Contracting Colonialism. A great book, by the way, if anybody's interested. It's just a fabulous kind of philological study of what one can learn from Tagalog. And he wrote, quote, "When Filipinos, for example, wanted to pick a fruit from a tree, plant or harvest rice, cross a stream, or pass any major landmark, they would ask permission from the protective spirit and make some appropriate offerings." Kenneth Dean, who's at National University of Singapore now, previously at McGill University, has also studied the networks of temples that developed in Singapore in the 16th century, Chinese temples, that is, and mapped those and studied the epigraphy that's associated with those. Therefore, there is uneven coverage between the early monk travelers' accounts in the 16th century, and much work remains to be done on the specific sites in the Philippines that were part of longer distance trade to other parts of Southeast Asia, which developed into significant centers of their own. So now I'll switch to talking about some of the monks movement that we can discern. So Anthony Reed has written that, quote, "There are discrete literatures on the Christianization of the Philippines and the Islamicization of the southern half of the region, mainly from Mindanao on down, while work on Buddhism in this period has hardly begun to cope with the difficulty of the sources," end of quote. And I couldn't say it any better. He's exactly right, just on pointing out what the focus has been and the problems of addressing the Buddhist history. So the Philippines has sort of been off the map, so to speak. I've showed you that previous one where it was cut out in the larger study of Buddhism in the Southeast Asian region. But in the pejorative view that was projected by the Spanish colonials who arrived in the Philippines was to present them as kind of barbaric or as even heathens or complete, that their kind of religion was this animistic religion that needed to be eradicated. And so we have one report that says, in the Philippines, there are some who still expect to find in a dense, dark Philippine jungle a Hindu temple or a Buddhist stupa. To them, sound history speaks sobering words about centuries spent on the outer rims of two mighty and successive Indonesian empires. And so even here, a glimpse that in spite of all of this, the first mention here of both Hindu temples and Buddhist stupas in the region is important. So early Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, is, as I said, largely lacking in written historical records. We only have some scant material to work with. Early texts from India, however, refer to the Philippines as the land of gold, the Suvarna Bhumi. And a Buddhist text refers to Indians going to the Philippines in search of gold. And so this reputation of the Philippines as a place for gold was quite widespread from East Asia all the way to South Asia. Nonetheless, we know now that regular maritime traffic between Fujian and the early polities of Southeast Asia had been well established by the 6th century, as monks from India who preached Buddhism in China had to go frequently to a place called Ling'an or Tranzhou to embark on their vessels to return home. And in 588 CE, for instance, an Indian monk named Kulanata went to Ling'an with the aim of setting sail for the kingdom of Langkasuka in what is today, I think, southern Thailand, though I'm not sure. Some of the geographic names are very difficult to try to take the Chinese term and then try to find where it is. Well, that's been a big source of debate for a lot of scholarship in the region. But others headed in the direction of Indonesia, like Fashian, for example. Now, fortunately for scholars interested in the place of the Philippines in the pre-colonial period, we can refer to the famous text called the Jufanzhi, that is to say, the Gazetteer of Foreign Lands that was compiled in, sorry, we'll skip over that. These are just showing you, oh, I should have mentioned this here, which was the, when I was mentioning the topic of gold. And this is a map showing the large concentrations of gold deposits. And this is the most, this is Mindanao here. And this section, particularly the northern tip of Mindanao, will figure importantly very shortly in this talk. And so getting a sense of where those large deposits of gold were is important. Now, in this Jufanzhi text, which was compiled in 1225, the author was this Zhu Ruguo or Zhu Ruguo, and he probably composed the text in 1224 or 1225 based on information that he gathered from earlier Chinese sources and from foreign merchants who he had interviewed. So he never left China, but he was listening to reports that were coming back to them. And he was stationed in the port city of Tranzhou, the very important connector for boats leaving out of China. And he was a supervisor of maritime trade. So he seems to have known a lot about what was coming in and out of China. And here's what we find in that source. And I've highlighted just one section. We won't need to read the whole thing, but he says, in the country of Ma'i. So there's been a lot of debate of what this Ma'i refers to. But the most recent scholarship identifies it as the site in the northern part of Mindanao, that area I just showed you on the map as a deposit of gold. And it says, which is to the north of Borneo. More than 1,000 families live in a single settlement on both sides of a river. The local people wear either a sheet of cotton cloth like a cloak or just a cotton loincloth. And then this is the line that I think is the most important and is very significant, I think, for the topic today. It says, there are bronze statues of the Buddha scattered in the fields of grass, but no one knows where they are from. And then it goes on, there are a few bandits, and all this kind of stuff, and gives a description of them. So this really jumped out at me when I saw this, this notion of just Buddhist images that are just scattered all over the ground there. And it seems not to, though, however, have attracted the attention of other scholars and just has kind of stood there in the text. And I think part of the problem for for the topic of Buddhism in the Philippines is that many of the scholars in Southeast Asia, and particularly scholars in the Philippines, don't read Chinese. And so they don't have access to the Chinese sources. So I mentioned to you the problem of the sources. If we have no texts that are in the Philippines, we have to look outside perhaps or utilize what's there. So some of the sources are in Chinese and the local scholars don't read Chinese. On the other hand, many of the Chinese scholars don't understand geography or the prehistory or early history of the Philippines. And so we have a kind of a disconnect where scholars haven't kind of come together, worked together to try to understand what's going on in that region. So we also now have at our disposal an even earlier text, and that is what's the famous Laguna copper plate inscription, and that's this. So again, these are the very few pieces that we have to this puzzle, and this one is dated to 900 CE, so it pushes the record back probably another 300 years or so. And this was acquired by the National Museum of the Philippines in 1990. The inscription is in Old Malay, and so this is another problem again for doing this research is the multilingual necessity of being able to read across many different languages that are represented on the material culture from the Philippines, including Old Malay, Sanskrit, and then even some Chinese as well. This copper plate also contains terms and concepts of Sanskrit origin and seems to indicate the presence of an Indic model of governance and the presence of Sanskrit terminology. The Laguna copper plate also links the Philippines with Srivijaya. And so here's a translation of it that was done by Elsa Clave and Arlo Griffiths. I think it's the most recent and up-to-date translation of this Laguna copper plate. So it says, "Hail, elapsed Shaka year 822, that converts to 900 CE, month of Vaishaka, according to the astral sciences, 4th of the waning fortnight, a Monday. That was the time when a female servant who had been taken over in debt bondage, together with her siblings called Buka," Si is an honorific name, very interesting term there, "child of this Namwan, was awarded a debt clearance document. It was awarded by the official army commander at Tundun with the title, this Dan Juan Nyaka Tunhan of Palaya Jayadeva. Regarding the specifics, with the scribe being cleared, what was resolved was his military debt amounting to 1 kati and 8 savarna that had been contracted in front of the following witnesses, of Pularan, Kusumaron, of Paila, with the title Ganasakti, titled Binwagan, with the title Bisruta. Okay, so it's a very complicated inscription, but nonetheless, Elsa Clave and Griffiths highlight how that the inscription is, quote, one of the very few Philippine historical documents dating from the pre-colonial period and the only one bearing information on the social life of the Manila region before the arrival of the Spanish, and in the larger context of maritime Southeast Asia as well. So it's a very significant kind of early piece of evidence. But for my purposes, as interesting as that inscription is, it has little of evidence that's useful for saying anything about the Buddhist history of the Philippines. Yet, about the same time that the Laguna copper plate inscription was discovered, another inscription was discovered in Butuan, that is to say the northern part of Mindanao, same region that I have been talking about. And it was discovered in a burial that had a body whose face was covered with a gold mask and had a diadem on its head. So it probably had what this, so if you ever, and I encourage you to go to the Philippines, if you're in Manila, right in downtown Manila is a very important museum called the Ayala Museum. Go to that museum and go up to the top floor, and there is an exhibition that'll just blow your mind of gold objects, hundreds and hundreds of gold objects, all which date to pre-Spanish colonial contact. So for all of those who were writing about the Philippines as these decrepit, animists who had no culture and all of this kind of stuff, go take a look at that and the fine workmanship on that gold and tell me that they did not have technology and sophistication. That collection is very important, but it's not well known and it's underutilized in scholarship. But this is probably the death or similar death mass that they were describing in this excavation report. And the new inscription has received a rather large amount of attention in some circles. An initial study of the inscription was done by a figure named Postma, a Dutch missionary scholar, but then he gave up on it. He found it too difficult and gave up. And then in the mid-1990s, the Dutch epigrapher J.G. de Casparis identified it as a Sanskrit protective mantra. No further work was done on it until 2010, when the Dutch Sanskritist Arlo Griffiths took up his turn at deciphering it. Based on the most recent research, especially a study and translation of it by Roderick Orlina, it seems to be a variation of a mantra from the Mahapratisara Sutra, this Da Suecho Doloni. And so this was a text that was very popular around the same time in China, as Minzhao knows, and this text appears on a 14-karat gold sheet in just 3 lines. So this is 14-karat gold, just has 3 lines, and it was written in what's called later Kawi script, which was popular from the 10th to the 11th century, and was likely used as an amulet based on the protective powers of the goddess Mahapratisara, and as it was used exactly that way in China. So this is a similar one from Sumatra dating to the 12th, 13th century. So we know these kinds of amulets were circulating in Southeast Asia, particularly related to this Mahapratisara text. And this is what his translation of it says. Om, O excellent nectar, Vra Vra, O purest one, Hum Fat Fat, protect the one named Anai, protect his body, provide peace for him, Svaha Om, O one with nectar eyes, O protector of the fetus, O one who attracts, the giver of long life, Hum Fat Fat, protect the one named Anai. So very similar to a lot of incantation types of texts that we have from China around the same time. And here you can also see the integration of Sanskrit terminology in the text as well. Now, the Anai mentioned in the inscription refers to a person named Angai, which is a name used in the Agusan region. Agusan is that area, again, of northern Mindanao. And this seems to be an appeal to the goddess Mahapratisara for protection. Scholars currently think that this was written by a Buddhist monk. And the medium of gold was important for its religious connotations, and it was a prestige material that was used for amulets and for the visualization of deities. The Chinese placed such amulets in tombs, and some were used as amulets around the neck for the birth of a son. And the connection to Southeast Asia may have come through the travel to Java by Amoghavajra in 718 and 741 to 746, since he also is the one who translated the Mahapratisara text. So Butuan, the place I've mentioned already, was a place with large gold reserves and was an important stop on the way to Java. It is also a location where these 9th century ceramics have been found in large quantities that I showed you some examples of. So that area of northern Mindanao was not, it was a place where it was a stop-off point going down to Java, but it also became a permanent residence for the Chinese merchants who were also working through, and these local communities developed around that site. We should also mention that the Philippines came under the influence of the Srivijaya Empire, which was probably the conduit through which more tantric elements came into the Philippines. Buddhists were in Sulu, that's the southernmost region closest to Borneo, by the end of the 9th century, and impacted by the local religion called the Tasugs that lived in that region. So you can see there's this intermixing that's going on of both the Chinese influence coming from the north, and then influence coming from the south from Srivijaya, but also then coming from the west to the east from South Asia, and we get a mixture of both Hindu and Buddhist material that shows up in the Philippines from that time onward. So Chinese sources do not record anything about the religious practices of the Butuan people, but there is a record of a certain Sri Pada Haji who presented a gold plate memorial to the Song Emperor Zhenzong in the year 1011. And I think I have a translate. Oh, so this shows that the region from where we have these old Malay inscriptions. So in this one, it says, this is the memorial that says, in the 4th year of the Dazhong Xiangfu era, in the month of February, the ruler of Puduan, Shilia, arrived from a distant place and sent an envoy named Liu Yuxie to present a gold tablet engraved with a message. They also brought gifts of cloves, white dragon's brain, tortoiseshell, and red parrots as tribute. At that time, there was a ceremony to worship the earth goddess in Fanyin, and the envoy was ordered to go to the court. They also presented a Kunlun slave, but the emperor felt pity for their foreign customs and ordered them to be returned to their homeland. At the same time, the ruler of Sanmalan married a Lan princess and sent an envoy to offer gifts of perfume, bottles, ivory, thousand-year dates, peaches, berries, rose water, white sugar, lapis lazuli bottles, and carrying vessels. The ruler of Wushun, Wuhong, and the ruler of Pupulo, Malahue, also sent envoys to offer gifts of perfume bottles. So the paucity or the lack of written records forces us then to avail ourselves of the material record unearthed in these archaeological finds. And the surviving material record for the Philippines is evidence of their place in the Southeast Asian trade network. But scholars have tended to overlook or ignore the further eastward spread of Hindu and Buddhist elements from the Philippines. And so, but in the trove of those gold objects in the Ayala Museum, we have a number of different objects that are of what I think are these Kimnara images or Garuda images that you can see in this one here with the wings. And looking at the hairdress, the art historians can sort of pore over all of this stuff and tell me if I'm wrong. But you can see the fine workmanship here on the gold as well. That's quite surprising. These are some of the more of the images of probably of these Kimnara images as well. And then this one, this is a headdress with a Jilin image, the Chinese mythical creature on it as well. And so in 1981, an incredible hoard of gold objects was discovered in Surigao del Sur, which is near Agusan in the, again, northern part of Mindanao. This hoard demonstrates that there was a localized Philippine gold craft industry that was Indianized, of Indianized inspiration. These objects depict things like phoenixes, these jilins, and suggest contact with China. The materials suggest that there was a widespread Hindu-Buddhist substrata in the Philippines before the arrival of Islam and Christianity. The collection at the Ayala Museum also attests to a shared religious, economic, cultural, and political connections between East, South, and Southeast Asia. Again, this collection is very, it's just quite an amazing one. I actually met the family. So this was the whole hoard that was found in that area. It just happened to be on the property of a family in the Philippines. And when it was discovered, you know, that was in the family's collection. So I met the son of the father who had actually commissioned archaeologists to do digs on his site. And they found all this stuff. And then as he got older, he felt uncomfortable having hundreds of these gold objects of Philippine patrimony. And so he decided to give it to the Ayala Museum. And when he told me that, it was very funny. He says, so I gave it over to the museum. And then his wife stepped in, interrupted him, and said, he didn't ask me about that. In any case, it's a real trove for future research. So this place, Butuan, in the north of Mindanao, was the first Philippine kingdom to establish diplomatic relations with China, and that happened in the year 1001, and that lasted for about 10 years. Then the next mission went in 1373, this time from Luzon. another Philippine island known as Mai, as I've shown in the earlier text or mentioned above, with traders attested from Guangzhou being a source for gold imported by China. We find, for example, lots of Guangdong ceramics in Butuan in the 11th century. Shipwreck goods discovered in waters off of Guangzhou show the influence going in the other direction as well, coming from Southeast Asia. And we can see the context for the gold ornaments on the Boxer Codex, images of people from different parts of the Philippines, which you see here with the primarily objects that are worn on the body, but also being carried. This work had been commissioned by the Governor General Gomez Perez Desmariñas in 1590 in order for the Spaniards to understand the customs and religion of the Philippines. This document records the worship of Vairochana, Bahatara, and other Indian deities that were worshipped in Luzon and in the Visayas. Now, we see further evidence of this in this Kalatagan Avalokiteshvara clay tablet that's also at the National Museum in the Philippines. Sorry, this is the only published image that I know of this, unfortunately, and it's very hard to see, but you can kind of make out this. And so people have done a lot of work on this to try to connect it. And the going theory is that they're calling this a version of the Avalokiteshvara Padmapani sort of style. And I leave it up to your kind of imagination to see if you see that. Probably the scholars have dated it to between the 12th and the 13th century as well. Now, artisans in the Philippines clearly knew about Buddhist artistic conceptions. The most impressive find to date, and perhaps in all of Philippine archaeology, is a 21-karat gold image known as the Agusan image. So this is, again, placing it right at the heart of where all of the gold deposits were. Now, this Agusan image is dated to the 9th or 10th century, and it was discovered in 1917 on the banks of a river that had flooded. So no archaeology. Basically, it was along a riverbank, and a flood had come through, dislodged the earth, and here was this gold image just sticking out of the ground. It does make you think back to that earlier Jufanjur account of a field just scattered with Buddhist images that's describing the exact same location in the northern part of Mindanao. The image was acquired after some changing of hands by the Field Museum in Chicago in 1922. It's most likely a Buddhist goddess named Vajralasya. The earliest reports when people first saw it, they called it a Tara image, but that's been revised most recently. And many more images of a similar type have been found on the island of Cebu in the Philippines as well. But this image most closely resembles images that are attested primarily in Java and forces us to look south rather than north for the connections. It looks most closely like images that were found in Eastern Java and would have been part of a Vajradhatu, or a diamond world mandala set of images. And it's specifically been identified as this Vajralasya figure. And it may be that the overall context of the Butuan kingdom was connected to active trade with China, though this object seems to have been made locally. So just to show you the kind of iconographic analysis people have done, this is the earliest published image when the Field Museum got it here. And so this is what the Vajradhatu set would look like. And they're probably linking it to the one on the side here. But if you look at other images, this one probably the close, this is the one that's used as kind of the proof case, just because the arm shapes of the figurine are rather strange, actually, I think, from most types of iconography, that this seems to be the closest analog for that image. Now, so this is, again, just about as close as the art historians can get in terms of identifying it. Now, there have also been some claims about the existence of a Song Dynasty Manjushri image in the Tabon caves in Palawan. So Palawan was that long piece that was stretching all the way down very close to all the way close down into Borneo. And so this is the only image. It was done by basically this American merchant who was sailing around Palawan and found this cave and he actually published an article, something along the lines of finding this lost Sphinx image, this outcropping here. And then he made this outlandish claims about how if you look very carefully, it looks like they had used this kind of glue to put rocks together, to shape it together and everything. I think it's a complete farce personally, and there's no evidence that's conclusive, and there's no good published images at all of it. But we do have some other, this is a list of what one scholar had compiled of all of the Buddhist images that one finds in the Philippines. These are scattered in different places. I've shown you the first two, but there's also an Avalokiteshvara image. There's somebody was speaking about Ganesh. There's so Hindu deity as well in Mactan here with Ganesha, Alokeshvara, another Ganesh image in another part of the Philippines, some bronze ornaments, more Garuda pendants and ornaments in another collection. So there is a growing body of material evidence just to show both Hindu and Buddhist icons that are in the Philippines. Now, the contact between China and the Philippines really took off in the 16th century when the Chinese were seen as useful for the Spanish and Portuguese who were trying to make incursions into the Philippines. This was a period in the late 16th century when the earlier Ming restrictions on trade were lifted and Chinese merchants began to spend more time in the Philippines. As Wang Gongwu has surmised, he says, "We know nothing about how the various trades were organized, but elsewhere, one center of community life was always the temple, whether to Tian Ho, the goddess of sailors, to Guan Yu, a deity preferred by merchants, or both, often joined later by the Buddha or a compassionate Guanyin. But because of the several massacres and because the Parian was moved several times, we have no relics of early temples in Manila or even any record of them having been there." So that's the problem that I mentioned earlier. And does one take... So you can imagine, how do you read the material record? On the one hand, you could say these few images are evidence of a thriving Buddhist culture that was there, that was destroyed by the Spanish. But that we have no proof, in a sense, of the relative scale, because you could also just make the argument that there was very few, and these are kind of outliers or just kind of vestiges of what was not a very strong community. So I think it presents some interpretive problems, to be sure. But during the period of the Tang and Song dynasties, the southern part of Fujian, particularly Zhangzhou Prefecture, became the most developed region of Buddhist belief in China, and each county had hundreds of temples. Consequently, many well-known Hokkien deities like Mazu, Guoshen Wang, or Baosheng Dadi, or Qingshui Zushi, or Kaizhang Shenwang, or Linshui Furen were exported to the Hokkien communities overseas by the merchants. In transplanting the folk culture, the Hokkien merchants not only added new or different new functions to these deities to cater to their needs, but also transformed the temples into communal centers for welfare, recreation, education, and philanthropy purposes. So this is what Kenneth Dean's been doing in Singapore, is mapping the Chinese temples and epigraphy throughout Singapore. And this is exactly the kind of project I think that we need for the Philippines now, to try to at least capture whatever record. In fact, the reports of a lack of material in the Philippines we should also take with a grain of salt, I think, because there hasn't been any systematic research. So you can't argue for a lack of evidence if people haven't really done the research that's necessary to prove that yet. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The historical record is, however, skewed even further due to the emphasis, as I mentioned at the outset, on Catholicism. What we can surmise, however, is that the early connections between China and Southeast Asia were through Buddhism, through the era of these traveling monks. And then from the Song dynasty, the 12th and 13th century, it became the newfound freedom of merchants who had previously been repressed that became the primary conduit of influence. Now, there's another approach we could take, which I haven't necessarily done except in the most minimal way, and that is to look at language and philology and to look for clues in modern or in Tagalog. And so we do find, these are just a kind of a sample of some Tagalog terms that I think you can see have a very clear Sanskrit origin to them. So Batala for Batara, a noble or a great person, a Mantala for a mantra, Diwata for Devata, Diwa for Jiva, Linga. And in fact, there's one archaeological report of unpublished, but of a farmer, landowner farmer, finding in his field a stone lingam, and also the yoni part of it as well seems to have been right next to it. Karna for karma, and I'll end in just a minute with a story about that. And then Muksha for moksha, Maharlika for Mahadika. And so one could go on with these. I think this would be another way to demonstrate some of the early connections would be to look through language. Now, even in the Boxer Codex, and this is the kind of final sort of interesting little tidbit of just trying to read the information that we do have and try to see what we can tease out of it for any evidence. So in this one, has a passage which looks very much like a kind of reincarnation story, where it says, in the past and at the present, they have known that they have a soul, which in describing these local people, on leaving the body and goes to a certain place that some call Kasan and others Macau. I don't know that. This, they say, is divided into two large towns with an arm of the sea in between. One, they say, is for the soul of mariners who are dressed in white, the others for all the rest who are dressed in red for greater attraction. They say that the souls which inhabit these places die 7 times, and some return to being alive and suffer, now this is the interesting part, and suffer the same travail and miseries that they suffered in this world in their bodies. So it sounds a lot like kind of karmic causation of one's actions having a reaction, and one being punished for what one has done to deserve them. So this is kind of where we're stuck. And the problem, is this is about, as far as I can tell, what we have as an evidence-based for now. And so when Ari Dai wrote his book on the modern Buddhism in the Philippines, he doesn't even comment on any of the earlier stuff, but really focuses just on basically a kind of the transmission of humanistic Buddhism to the Philippines with groups, particularly Fo Guangshan and CGA from Taiwan as well. And really, but those groups have not been very successful in establishing firm roots in the Philippines either. There's very, very few Buddhist temples today in the greater Philippines, even in the major urban centers like Manila. Some of these are not very well established or very well attended either. So let me conclude then by just saying we still have much to learn about the Philippines before we can begin to fill out the partial historical picture that we've inherited. The historians who wishes to understand better the place of the Philippines within the larger Sinosphere faces a number of significant challenges related to the colonial period of massive destruction of the material and textual record of the pre-colonial era. From my perspective, there are 2 main areas of possible research that we can look forward to. One is more thorough analysis of their surviving textual sources in Chinese. I still think that there's a lot more that one can find scattered throughout Chinese records, but the problem is that most scholars reading those records, when they encounter particularly geographic terms, are not familiar with those place names in Southeast Asia, and often just either give up or come up with some fanciful reading. So making those correlations of particularly geographic texts and place names seems to be an important next step, and one that could open up a whole new range of research as well. So many, if not most, of the scholars in Southeast Asia do not read Chinese and have tended to leave those sources out of consideration. The second area of possibility is in subsequent archaeology that might be done in the Philippines. So I've been encouraging the universities to begin to do more systematic archaeology in the Philippines. It just is a funding problem, and it's been difficult to get that started. There are certain areas, as I've said, that have yielded promising discoveries, such as the area of Butuan and its major gold reserves that were useful for Buddhist image making, such as that Agusan image that I showed you. That I think all of this would justify further systematic archaeology. The next phase of this scholarship will have to find ways to better understand the Buddhist traditions that were most prominent in the Philippines. So I think we have some good evidence that there's a strong, what we might call tantric influence that's coming in from the south. But there are also these kind of Hindu Buddhist mixtures that one finds there as well. Now, at present, it seems, however, that these main traditions were, as I said, related to tantric traditions that moved around maritime Southeast Asia, particularly during the Srivijaya kingdom. The land of gold may, in short, still reveal more treasures that allow us to write a more complex history in the future, but that's all we can say for tonight. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any energy left, happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you very much, Professor
Yeah.
Robson, for this very exciting and also informative talk. So now I think it's the time we open the ground for questions. Okay.
I knew the art historians would chime in. Yeah.
Well, firstly, I have to thank you, James. This is just so evocative. And I especially appreciate that you essentially gave us a lesson in fragmentation as method.
That's a good way of taking a vice and turning it into a virtue.
Well, I mean, I have to grapple with this all the time,
Yeah.
this issue of working with completely fragmented
Yes.
objects, but also a fragmented corpus.
Yeah.
In my work on sort of the Eastern Deccan and the sites in Andhra specifically. And actually, this idea of not having a complete corpus, Peter Skilling has called this the Deccan gap, by which, of course, he means that there are no textual records. There's no literary texts that we can sort of use, but of course there are inscriptions and there's the art. And in fact, Alo has worked on translations of these inscriptions in the Eastern Deccan. So, there's some common ground there. But
yeah.
I'm interested in the art, of course. And what is so clear to me when I see that list, your list of 9 objects,
Yeah.
which is so sparse,
Yeah.
actually, what's immediately clear to me is 2 things. One is that we're looking at bronze, gold, clay, materials that are all inherently renewable. You can melt them down, you can,
Right.
they're very easily degraded and sort of, renewable essentially. And so there's no stone is my
Exactly.
question, which is
Weird.
weird.
Yeah.
You said it, I didn't.
Yeah.
It's strange. It is strange that there's no stone. So that's one question. Why do you think that's the case? And B, also I'm finding that this list is just a list of portable objects.
Mhm.
So they're renewable and they move.
Portable. Yeah.
So yeah, why do you think that is? So that's one question. And the second is,
Can I do that first? Because otherwise my brain at this time, so I got in at like 1:30 last night. So if you guys are tired, just think about, I traveled for 35 hours and then got in around 1:30 in the morning. So let me just briefly, so the one of the things that's been so great about the work that Ken Dean's been doing in Singapore is the number of inscriptions that are there that they've collected. And that is hugely important for the kind of work we want to do. I kept waiting to discover that there were stone inscriptions around the Philippines, and so far have not, except for some people who talk. And I haven't been able to, I've been able to make a trip to the northern part of Mindanao. I was just there about a month ago. But I haven't been able to go out to Palawan or to where this Tabuan cave is. And some people have said that in that cave setting, which this crazy American mariner guy claimed to see this image, nonetheless, there are other reports that some people have found some inscriptions there, and I can't verify that, but it is weird though. And it could just be the affordance of the landscape too. We're dealing with areas where you don't have the kind of hard stone or even a lot of stone necessary. It's very volcanic, right? In the Philippines, the mountains aren't made of granite or sandstone or anything. They're primarily volcanic, and so you can't inscribe on those. So that's the issue of the stone. And the portability, I think, makes sense. I mean, this is what, if you think about, the transmission of Buddhist images from South Asia to East Asia, they were portable. You could, carry small images with you. So the portability seems to match, very similar story. That's merchants that are moving along. And so not surprising, I think. There's a whole kind of history, I think, of that also unwritten to a large extent, which is the religious practices of boatmen, maritime travel, and the deities that were kept on ships. And so we know there's a lot of Mazu images and things like that. But these Chinese junk ships had altars on them as well. And so I have a feeling that's the smallness and portability is another connection to the maritime context of all of this as well. Yeah.
So you're implying that there aren't any sites per se, except maybe this cave.
Yeah. So I'm at this point unwilling to accept that statement that there aren't sites. If we look at the iconoclastic regimes of the Spaniards in other parts of the world and understand and look at the Philippines as a similar case. If you look, say, for example, in South America and Mexico, and the complete just wiping clean of the altars and cleaning out of religious imagery of local traditions, it's a wholesale destruction, except in the cases when they sent images back to Europe to prove that they had converted or gotten rid of these heathens, okay? And so, I don't know. I mean, this is an area, again, this is like such preliminary kind of work that I'm just sort of trying to put together tonight. There's a lot, like what I would like to look through is, because I was surprised in finding in European collections, and I just haven't looked for it yet for possible ones from the Philippines, but places like the London Missionary Society, which existed for quite a while and then disbanded in the early 20th century. And those objects then, some of them went into the British Museum, some went into the Victoria and Albert, but most of it's kept in storage lockers. So it takes going and looking through. And I have seen images from other parts of Asia that are in those lockers that were sent back. And so the irony, which I love, is that the iconoclast became the preserver of the images that they were trying to get rid of in Asia, and now they're preserved in Europe, and it's just like perfect, the irony of that, because they were gone. And same thing with African imagery. You can't do African art history unless you work in the only collections are in Europe. So sorry. Do you want to ask your second one, and then we'll go to Tansen?
Am I allowed to ask a second question? Okay.
Yeah.
It's about the Laguna inscription and also how you're looking at terms. So you're trying to identify terms that may indicate the presence of Hindu-Buddhist material.
Yeah.
But the Laguna inscription actually, beyond the terms, the structure, I mean, you'll have to ask Arlo this,
yeah.
But it seems like a Buddhist donative inscription structurally.
Right.
Yeah. So do you think about that at all? Because it's, it's that standard sort of donative formula.
So this is always the peril of venturing into an area where I don't read Old Malay. And so I'm just so glad that those guys, that Elsa and Arlo worked on that text so that I could benefit from there. But I'm totally dependent on what they say about that, to be honest. I mean, the clearest thing is that we're dealing with a completely multilingual environment where one finds a mixture of Old Malay, Sanskrit, and other mixtures that are in there. And so no, I can't really say much more about it. The structure of the Mahapratisara one is very, very similar. I mean, exact to what one finds in Chinese translations of that as well. So I feel a little safer working with that one, but I'm, I've also met with Andre Akri about, and I think we were talking, and I think he's inspired now to actually begin doing some work in the Philippines as well, which would be a great, somebody who really knows, particularly that southern contact coming up from Srivijaya in that area. And so I'm hoping he'll continue. But there's not a lot of current, as far as I know, none, unless that one kicks off, of people doing really sustained work in the Philippines, either on the linguistic, philological front or the art historical front. So, yeah. Yeah, Tansen?
Yeah. So for the Zoom audience, so if you are interested in asking questions, so please just type your questions into the Q&A box, and then we're going to collect some of them and then let Professor Robson.
Oh, you just have to turn it on, yeah.
So for the audience on Zoom, so if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A boxes, and we're going to collect some of them and then let Professor Robson to answer them.
Thank you, James. That cutoff map is from one of my articles, I think.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, because I had no idea about Buddhism in Philippines, and that's an issue. But the most important finding regarding Buddhism is from Egypt more recently.
Oh, right, yeah, of course.
Berenike, right?
Yep.
And it has an inscription.
Yeah.
It has images. But and we had a discussion about this at Yale recently.
Yes.
And people asked Sangeeta's question, so what? There's no evidence of practice of Buddhism beyond perhaps the merchants who were there. In this case, I mean, this is a problem in Southeast Asia, all over the place. So you have objects, right? The earliest object is the Buddha Gupta inscription from Kedah.
Right.
But there's no evidence about practice of Buddhism. And Fashion also goes to Sumatra or Java, says there's no Buddhism here, right? So how can we then connect the presence of objects to actual practice of Buddhism, right?
Yeah.
And this is unlike what I think Kalyani was saying. When you have stone inscriptions, that inscription is not donative. It's a legal inscription, it seems. But
it's a release of the bondage that somebody had been fined for this woman who had been taken.
And given that there's so much of stone evidence from Sumatra or Java, images and so forth, we don't find that in Philippines, right? And even for the later period when the Chinese come in, and one of the earliest Chinatowns in the world is in Philippines, right? And then you have the Chinese elements coming in. But I don't know if that's Buddhism or is it a local practice of some sort of Sanja Hui, right? I mean, it's a 3 kinds of religions built in one that spreads with Hokkien and Cantonese to all these places in Southeast Asia.
Unless it's a different Sanjiao, it could be Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism.
That's Singapore. But I think we still are stuck. So in the spirit of today's questioning of relevance, my question is, was there Buddhism in Philippines?
Yeah. No, I think it's a fair question because, this is the perils of material culture is that it doesn't speak beyond what we see. And I think there are snippets of evidence that I think are demonstrated in some of those texts of some kind of community that was there, that was producing those images, that one could make, I think, a reasonable supposition that there had to be some, when you're talking about hundreds of images that are scattered, why else would you produce those? I mean, I guess you could come up with a theory and just say these were perceived to be powerful objects and you would have to have some, again, a context to really say that it's Buddhism. But nonetheless, those images, one can't deny, I think, those reports. And it may be, again, that what I often look for in the absence of testimonials or the types of, so the nice thing about stone inscriptions usually is that we have lists of donors and we have usually some kind of a testament of like why it was commissioned, right? And then it gets to, you can start to say things about belief or and things like that. The other place, ironically, I think that we can often find material, and I was thinking about this as a next area to look, and it seems ironic, but I would look in some of the Spanish records because the critique of practices can be an equally good source for trying to discern something about the practices that were what people were doing. And they may be overblown, or they may be overly pejorative in trying to demonize. And I think that's what the Spanish were doing in some cases. But I think we have to look very carefully at the language and tease out what we can. But otherwise, you're right. I mean, we are kind of stuck with a silent historical record, but with tantalizing pieces that suggest that there was something there. And again, I think that unless unless we question the veracity of the Zhufanzhi text, which I don't know, I don't have any reason to question that reporting that's in there. To describe an area as just littered with Buddha's images. But why are they scattered in a field is the next question.
There's an explanation for that, because there was an anti-Buddhist sentiments in different parts of Southeast Asia when statues were destroyed and spread. So these are perhaps these destroyed images of Buddhism, which was
evicted.
Yeah. So there's all this conflict between Hindus and Buddhists.
So one thing that actually, I'll just tell you the way I was trying to approach this, just might be interesting just for this, for people attending the workshop too, is that, so the goal was to try to bring together two streams of material that were largely separate in the scholarship. One was the flow of Buddhism in Southeast Asia. The second one was the flow of merchants and the establishment of communities that we didn't know much about, dot to dot, through the Philippines. And so I thought, if we could identify the locations, just like what you're saying, and I think to ground where the material is coming from, and I think I've got a pretty good handle on that now, where the major centers were. And those, we do know that, as you know, these, you had merchants who would stop off there, but then they started trading, and they were actually, because there was so much gold, they were actually selling things to the locals on kind of on a commission basis almost, where they would then go off and sell their materials and then come back and pay the boat, the merchants on the boats, a part of the profit from the sale as well. And what that meant was that that sometimes took some time. And so these sort of not permanent Chinatowns, but rather long periods of a couple of months where you had long-term residents, Chinese residents there, and those grew up into towns in some cases as well. So I was hoping those two streams would kind of come together better. But again, you just hit a limit of how far how close they can get. But that was my goal.
There are two questions online. How you want? And then Benjamin.
Then there was a couple of, thank you for your thought. For written early religious you have. Whether the early religious you have, because the church is willing to approach it with the idea of destruction with all curiosity, religion is more complex than negative, and there's a tradition of not saying, blah, 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 blah. I'll be all interested in Malay, but not Chinese. There's the Filipino elite who orientalize their past and say. Okay, so I agree, there actually are some of this. So, it becomes very easy and I think kind of seductive sometimes. Everyone loves to hate the missionaries and what they did. But in fact, in many cases, some missionaries did learn local languages, local dialects, and they actually became what I would call very good ethnographers, in fact. And so, indeed, the descriptions that are given of certain cultural practices in the Philippines by those missionaries are quite valuable as reporting of what's going on in the region. So it's not all over the top, critique. And so, but nonetheless, the historical record of the effect of that missionization on particularly the iconoclasm that came with it would be difficult to deny, I think. So the lack of interest because of destruction of the church, but also there's a pre-colonial past frame with the Malay world. Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah, so there is a whole other, I think what the sentiment probably of both of those, and I have a lot more that I would have to do on this as well, is to think about what is the relationship of the Philippine Islands. And again, I think, Tantan was saying this morning, or this afternoon, whenever it was, about how do we think about these areas beyond modern nation state boundaries. And I think that is really key to this as well, to step back, in a sense, in thinking about the island chain beyond just thinking about it as the modern. Yeah. Exactly, a whole, yeah, and so, but are there, and I take the question as something I just don't know the answer to yet, which is to say, what are some of the intra-Southeast Asian kind of pejorative views of different cultures against each other, or these local areas? So I take that as something that would be interesting to look into. Yeah, Ben.
Thank you for this really fascinating and rich presentation. I actually wanted to also go back to the Zhufan.
Yeah.
But for me, I think the fact that thieves rarely went there is kind of suggestive of some kind of ritual practice. And I was...
The fact that what?
Thieves never went there.
Oh, thieves.
Yeah.
Oh.
So there's all this metal around there, but no one goes there. And so and also because we have something that was thrown into the river, I was kind of thinking about like toulongjian or these other kind of rituals in a Chinese context of throwing things away.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether we can reconstruct any kind of Buddhist or Hindu or kind of local practice that incorporates these images into understanding ritual in that way.
I have no idea. I would love it if that were the case. I love the toulongjian. Yeah, does everybody know the throwing of the dragon slips, where you take the two parts and you throw one part into and make a compact with the deity? But I just think, the way that it all read to me as if it was abandonment rather. But how does one, again, there's very little we can kind of say about that. But the fact that every time that when there's a flood, these images are kind of popping out of the riverbanks and things does make one wonder, like, why along the riverbanks? What's going on there? So I don't know. I like the speculation. If you could help me prove that, I would have a much stronger argument on religious ritual and practice here. But no, I think right behind you is gonna. Yeah, sure. Why don't, just pass the mic around and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Professor Robson. I just have a very broad question. So I take it that these items that we see on the screens, like the Buddha statue or the Buddha sculpture, I think they're just merchandise rather than just burial goods, right?
What makes you think that?
I do not know, because that's not the kind of thing that you would see in a tomb, I guess. I think, yeah, that might be possible, because I'm just thinking that if they are really merchandise, then this obviously contradicts with a couple of the Buddhist doctrines, right? And what was the mentality of the Fujian merchants that
What would they contradict?
Well, I mean, think about the first schism, right? The first divide between the sects. It has something to do with gold, especially. And also, you have these, well, you say that you're a Buddhist practitioner, and it may have something to do, say, with greed or, yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, in fact, this is the big critique of Indian images when Islam comes in, is not that it's anthropomorphic representation, but it's a congealing of wealth, and therefore they were melted down and made into coins and distributed and things like that. So there is that kind of critique. But I think holding Buddhists to some kind of an ideal that's represented in text, also, I think we know from history that also is not something that is held to, right? But I think and maybe the two, sorry, I didn't do what I was supposed to do, was to let them ask questions, but the two are so related in a sense, because the one area where I think we have what you might call ritual is in those Ayala Museum death masks and some of the other materials that are in there. That definitely is not merchandise, that kind of thing. Those were, you can actually see the impression of the face on them. And those were tomb goods, to be sure. So, but I take your point. You know, I do think that you're right in the sense that the area of northern Mindanao with the gold reserves was a place where, and this is, I think, you know, the image that was found in Egypt, unless you guys discussed it and came up with a different conclusion, I think the conclusion was that it was made locally in Egypt. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I think similarly here, we have production site, and those are then actually moving out from there as well as merchandise with mercantile trade. So yeah, so I think in other words, I agree with part of what you're saying and revise it just a little bit, but I think you're onto something. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Everybody's still awake and stuff.
Question. As I can see that we have many texts about Chinese history,
Yeah.
and many archaeological finds, but always we don't make tight connection, such as some artifacts, we can't find direct text. It is confusing me many times. Yeah. And do you think that it is better to make the archaeological find a line and the taxi another line? Yeah.
In the orange shirt here. Yeah, you do speak loud. Good. Internet people need to hear you. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I was just going to make a comment on the Zhu Fanzhi text. So my interpretation of the translation of like thieves rarely go there. I think my reading of the original text is that there were very few pirates. So I think it has more to do with the geographical location rather than like religious tradition.
Yeah, possibly. There's a whole history of piracy that's now taking off, and again, most of that is concentrated along the coastline with these Woko figures, from going to Japan and along there. But there's also recent research that's showing how certain changes in Song Dynasty trade regulations for merchants actually drove those boat owners to start, because they were having to pay high price duties, kind of funny in our time with high tariffs, right? The tariffs drove them into illicit activities of piracy and thieving and things like that. We don't know, I don't know yet how far that may have extended also down into the Philippines as well. We knew it extended all the way to Vietnam and all the way to Japan up in that area. So I'm holding out that there may be a story to be told there as well. But that's an interesting, if that is, I'd have to go back and rethink it, if it's referring to that or not, but that's possible. The question about text and materiality, I think you can't separate we have to use any evidence that we can. Right now, one thing, and I wasn't going to mention this, but I'll go ahead and just do it, is that I found an old report by a very good scholar, Berthold Laufer, who some of you may know the name of, studied all kinds of interesting aspects of Chinese history.
Jade.
What's that?
Jade. He wrote about jade.
He wrote about jade, yeah. He wrote about everything. You look at his collected works, he actually has a very almost entirely unknown, very short little piece on records of the Philippines in Chinese historical sources going all the way back to the Tangshu. And I just didn't have the time to check his work, and I didn't want to represent it through his writing on it. But that's on my list. So in the Tangshu, in the Songshu, he has isolated some sections that he thinks are connected to the Philippines, in opposition to some other very good scholars, actually, who he claims got the place names wrong. So I'm very interested to go back and just kind of look at it fresh. It's one of those challenges. We don't have a good concordance for those geographic names. So a lot of it is based on either sound or local description. So anyway, that may be one way to bring some more, and I don't think it would help us to get to Tansen's question, because what they're reporting on is very different than writing a religious history. It's more governmental information and trade and what the people there's very little, I think, on religion in those, as far as I know. But that's something, just homework that I've left to do. Okay, 2 more questions. Okay, I'm ready. I hope.
Yeah, I think the materials we talked about today are relatively early, but I just suddenly recall that a while ago I was working on a Chinese text from late 16th century, actually, called 东夷图说, and they had an entry on Lü Song, which says its people always
Luzon.
Yeah, always 礼佛讲经, so they were always attending to the Buddha and chanting sutra. But at the time, I always think it's sort of a misinterpretation of sort of a Christian practice. I was just wondering.
That would be really interesting. So yeah, as I mentioned, there are so there are these different sources leading all the way up that I don't know the date of that text. So right around colonial contact period. So it would be interesting to look in there. I'm assuming the Luzon is Luzon, and so if that's the case, then that might give us one little, another piece of this puzzle. But they're so, you can understand the challenge, right, of just linking these. You get these tiny little snippets, and how to kind of take that accrued body and tell a larger story from it is something. I think on the one hand, it takes some bravery, I guess, to try to do that. And it also takes some hubris to try to make too strong of a claim from it. So I try to stay a little bit conservative in not making too strong of a claim for things. But send me the reference. I'd like to take a look at it. I'm not sure if that's one I've collected or not. So yeah. Because
the participants, Tita's here and there. Go on, Tita.
Okay.
I don't have much of a question.
See, the general's taking control again, man. We know who's in charge. Yeah.
I was just wondering, if I'm not too mistaken, Manila had Inquisition, right? And so, why would you not look at the Inquisition records? That's the best place to go. This is what works on even Guan Konkani Hinduism, right? A lot of scholars have actually looked at the Guan Inquisition records, even to figure out Guan Christianity. And so that's one place. And another place which I am finding in my own work, which is completely unrelated to your research, but then I'm finding a huge source base, which I never really thought about, is the Jesuit archives in Rome. This is not fully related to sort of conversion, but much more detailed ethnographic sort of material that you might find.
So the Dominicans were a bit more strongly represented in the Philippines, but the Jesuits were there as well, everywhere. And fortunately, so one of the other archive outside of Rome that's also a major one is at the Ritchie Institute, which just moved to Boston College, so it's near. So I've been going to their archive to try to look for some of this as well. So that's part of it, is just to look through Inquisition records, but also just random jottings of some of the Jesuits. I have a tremendous amount of respect. I think that one comment of just how the Jesuits were incredibly well educated, as you know, and they also were very careful in languages they knew, and they were also very close observers of things, and so they can be very useful. So yes, I agree. There's just more homework to do. But I also was thinking just about the previous question too. One other method I think to get at this possibly is if if it's possible to establish a kind of basic lexicon of geographic terms that I now know it's taken a while to get a good feel for the text for those terms, and then do the reverse rather than just searching, but basically start plugging those terms in. Now we have such a good digital record of things that we can perhaps turn up things that have been overlooked just by going back the other direction and using the Chinese terms for the place names in the Philippines, and then seeing how many more entries we get, like the one that was just mentioned. So that is another, I think, promising area to kind of explore. Yeah. Oh, we got one more. You gave a bonus one, Tansen.
Thank you for.
Now watch. This is going to be this is the one that's going to take me down. Yeah, it'll be like the final one.
One simple question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your speech. And as you mentioned, Yi Jing.
Yeah.
He went to Sumatra and stayed in Sri Vijaya in Sanskrit, but it seems he never has been to Philippines.
Right.
So it occurs to me if it's possible that one important reason ancient Philippines has been overlooked just because it wasn't on the routes to India.
So that I don't think we can draw from that, actually. I mean, maybe Tansen can chime in on this, but my again, this is just kind of a building feeling that I have is that we don't know in some cases about those routes. I mean, it may be that Yi Jing didn't go through the Philippines on his way down, but it clearly was a route for merchants. And so, they're not always giving us full itineraries either, or place names are misunderstood. So I'm not ready to completely give up on the thought that it was completely insignificant or peripheral, or that it didn't matter or wasn't part of those routes. I just think we have a lot more to learn about what those were. So I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you mentioned this. Not everything is about India and China.
Yeah.
Borobudur was Borobudur was not in the way between India and China, but Borobudur developed something very, very important. So I think there is a reason to understand Southeast Asia from Southeast Asia perspective, and not see it as an extension of China or extension of India. There are lots of things, very interesting things going on within Southeast Asia, and the internal connections needs to be mapped out. I think that's the next step.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So let's thank Professor Robson again for this wonderful talk.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Yeah. And thanks to the online people. Yeah. Hanging in there.
Thank you.